Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Heritage Voices. I'm Jessica Yaquinto, and I'll be your host today. And today we are talking about the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum. Before we begin, I'd like to honor and acknowledge that the lands I'm recording on today are part of the Nooch or Ute Peoples Treaty Lands, the Dinétah, and the ancestral Puebloan homeland. So today we have Dr. Joe Stahlman on the show. Dr. Stahlman is the director of the Seneca Nation's Seneca-Iroquois National Museum and Seneca Nation's Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Joe is a scholar and researcher of Tuscarora descent. He has over 20 years of research experience working with First Peoples. His research focuses on culture and history, as well as ongoing socioeconomic and health and wellness related endeavors with Native communities. He takes an active role in addressing the space Native peoples occupy in North American archaeology and cultural resource management. He regularly talks on the need to promote equity among all peoples in North American society through a number of reconciliatory processes, which are inclusive for all and empowers people to express agency through creative and intellectual endeavors. So welcome to the show, Joe.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So we're really excited to have you. We're being me. I'm really excited to have you for a couple of reasons. First of all, always excited to get another cultural anthropologist on the show. I know we're on the Archaeology Podcast Network, but I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, so that's always exciting. And also, we had a listener who highly recommended having you on the show after listening to your talk in New York on New York burial laws. So he's a member of the Archaeology Podcast Network, and he recommended it through the Archaeology Podcast Network's Slack channel. So thank you. You know who you are. And yeah, really excited to have you here.
Thank you. First, can I tell that person thank you for referring me?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they will be very excited to hear.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so to get us started, could we hear a little bit about what got you into this type of work, how you got into this field, what piqued your interest?
It was my birth that got me interested. My father is Tuscarora, who belonged to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and my mother is non-native. She is from Niagara Falls, German heritage, Dutch, Pennsylvanian Dutch. Her family migrated to Niagara Falls in the 1930s. My mother met my father while they were in high school, and I am the subsequent result of that meeting. Growing up, I was placed in a very odd situation. For people out there who are mixed, they won't think it's so odd because this is kind of a common story that a lot of us share. But for me growing up, I was in situations where my non-native family would say I was native, and my Tuscarora family would say, well, you're not Tuscarora, but you're native. And so that led me down a very windy road of exploration, so to speak. For me, my earliest friends were books. My grandmother, my non-native grandmother, actually purchased all of these Time Life books for me, The Old West. There was another series on Indians, and I just spent all my waking hours reading about Native peoples while having that thought in the back of my head, am I an Indian or not? And as I made my way through life, I kept encountering situations where people kept defining my identity for me without allowing me to have any agency, so to speak, in that determination of who I was. And so by the time I got into high school, I knew what anthropology was. I was regularly reading ethnographies because, these were the experts going out into the bush, spending about 2 years with communities, and they would come out as the experts with their books and their studies and their videos on everything that they learned about these people while they're in the bush with them. And by the time I graduated high school, I knew I wanted to be an anthropologist. For me, it wasn't so much culture per se that really got me interested. It was the idea of race and what are the rules of race? What are the facts of race? And how do we know these things? When I was in high school reading about this stuff, I started to read a lot on race and race issues and race science. As you probably know, Jessica, there is a race science out there. And for a very long period of America's history, there was a racial science going on throughout America. So when I was in high school, Jessica, people would say, oh, you're an Indian, or you look funny, or you're Mexican, or you're Latino. And so I used to make jokes with my Native friends. If I ever was going to write a biography, an autobiography of my life, I was going to title it My Life as a Latino, because I have been mistaken more to be Latino than Native. And so as a result, living in Texas, which also had a big influence on my upbringing and my identity, and maybe my identity issues that I had as a teenager and as a young adult, these ideas of race and who gets to make up those rules, who gets lumped into categories, who gets to be part of the in-group and the out-group, it's still of interest. Even like it's been over 30 years at this point, and I continuously love reading the newest race science. I also like reading about where anthropology is in this discussion, because even that has taken an interesting turn in the last few years with DNA studies. And so, the further I delve into this realm of research, it's not even less complicated at this point. It's just getting more complicated with these DNA tests you can go buy at the local Walmart, take it and send it in. Because now I have to listen to a lot of people telling me what their results say, and they want to share it with me. And it is interesting.
Right.
But a lot of people, so this is the takeaway that I took out of my undergrad in anthropology. Race is not real. Race is a social construction. And the rules of race are determined usually by those in power. And so for me, my biggest teaching point that I like to share with people is I like to go back to antebellum United States. And within the antebellum United States, you hear lots of discussions of our Black populations who were enslaved, and then your Native populations who were disenfranchised and more than likely removed from their homelands to a distant homeland far off somewhere. And I started really paying attention to these ideas of race. One of the sticking points of these rules that kind of popped out to me during my undergrad was, in order for someone to be defined as a Black person or an African living in the United States that time, they only needed to have one drop of Black blood to be qualified as a African descent and someone who could lose their rights as a human being and be enslaved. And on the flip side of that same coin, because this comes from the same keepers of the laws, you have someone defining Native peoples. If you were less than a quarter Native, you were not considered to be Native anymore. And to me, I thought that was really funny about the United States and how they approached race. And so for me at that moment, I realized that race was a social construction. However, it took me a few more years to realize that race is actually a very real idea that really controls many, many of our discourses in society nowadays. And I find it a little alarming because we spend so much time arguing and fighting over racial matters when we actually have more in common than we don't.
Okay, so you talked about your early experiences in anthropology, especially like your interest in race. How did that change when you got to college and grad school? And where did you take your interest in anthropology from there?
So yes, my undergrad was, just a general, anthropology degree. I studied the four subfields. I was interested in all of them. However, with language, I'm not the best language learner. I have difficulties with it. I'm a little dyslexic. And so that's been one of my weaknesses in the four subfields. However, within the realm of anthropology, the other three subfields, they really have kept my interest. And in terms of coming to terms with who I am and my ancestry and all the rules that come with race, I just became more and more fascinated by everything and anything about Native folks. And so by the time that I was approaching my senior year, I had a couple mentors in my department, and they were like, Joe, you're pretty smart. However, no one's going to listen to you without a master's. And I was like, I don't want to do any more school. I don't want to do any more school. I just want to work. I just want to be in the field. I want to work. I want to address a lot of these issues that bother me. Nonetheless, I went on. I did a master's degree. I did it at Idaho State University, and I did it in medical anthropology. I became interested in how people looked at infectious diseases. And so while at my department, I started to look at HIV/AIDS. I started to work with migrant farm workers who were coming through our area on their circuit throughout the growing season. And I started to spend time with men, farm working men. A lot of them were indigenous or mestizo from Mexico and Guatemala. And I started to ask them things about HIV/AIDS, sexual practices and behaviors. And a lot of these men instantly came off as saying, I'm not gay. I don't do that. I'm not gay. However, in their narratives, they were telling me so much more. And so that also added another layer to my identity, because I started to think about how we impose identities on people because of certain things, such as sexual practices, our religions, our political affiliations, and all the way down to music in high school. Do you remember in high school, if you listened to a certain music style, you got kind of lumped into a group? At least in my high school, that was the case. And so, this is just an ongoing thing. And it just kind of dawned on me, it's almost like a human universal that we kind of, we find ways to categorize ourselves and others. And it just kind of took me deeper and deeper into this, Jessica. And it didn't simplify anything. It just made me realize how complex we are as human beings. And we don't like to keep anything simple. And so this whole time that I'm learning about these Latino farm workers and life, on the road and in the field, I'm actually learning a lot about myself. Because a lot of these things that I thought were immutable, such as my sex, my race, I realized that they are quite mutable, and we are human beings, and nothing really holds us into these categories except for the power of words of other peoples. And for a long time, I didn't realize how strong identity construction was until I started seeing transgender folks really starting to make waves. And I don't mean waves in a negative way, but people like standing up and demanding their rights to be seen in the way that they are constructing themselves to be. And I found that really empowering. I really did. However, as time passed on, there were these little anomalies that popped up. One of these little anomalies that I would like to bring up right now is Rachel Dolezal. I found her really fascinating. I don't know if I agree with her, though, Jessica. So being someone who straddles that line of being in the middle between two different ethnic groups, I don't know if I completely agree with her, but I saw her argument as one of interest. And I really would like to talk about it at some point in a paper, but I have yet to get there. And this idea that I would like to talk about at some point is transracialism, because we have tons and tons of examples of people throughout history in our Native communities who have left one identity and became another one throughout their lives. And why not? I look at our own Native communities and, in many cases, we don't carry on the same name throughout life. We get handed different names at different times as our lives change to fit what we're doing. And so why can't we do that with these ideas of race, right? So I really felt for Rachel Dolezal, to be honest. She came from a home where she didn't value herself. She didn't see the cultural capital or the social capital of what her gender and race held for her where she lived. She lived in rural Montana. Her family adopted 2 young Black men. They adopted those young men into their family. And it seemed like Rachel saw there was more cultural capital in having a Black skin and having Black identity. And what do you know? That's what she did. She redefined herself. She constructed this story of her Blackness, and she went ahead with it, and she got pretty far with it. And I think that's where I don't agree with her. Whereas there's lots and lots of people out in the world who have Native ancestry who do feel an affinity to those communities, but they would never do anything that Rachel did. And that was the one thing that I have trouble with Rachel that makes her a little disingenuous with me, is that fabrication of story. And, one thing I know about where I stand in life, Native communities are always welcoming, even if you are of their blood or not, quote unquote blood, right? If they like you and, you listen, you spend time with them and you care about them, they're going to care about you and bring you in. And that's been my whole experience, my whole life. And I really couldn't ask for more. I would never take the route that Rachel took because, one, it's going to catch up to you at some point. But 2, it doesn't help you in your struggles to figure out who you are and what your plan is for this life.
Right. And like you were saying, the key being maybe, that she, made it up. Or lied about it, I guess, maybe would be the better way of putting it. And then used it to as an advantage for progressing career-wise, I guess, basically. I'm sure there's a much more eloquent way of putting it, but but basically that.
No, I'm with you. And yeah, and actually you made me think about the woman from last summer. She was at an Ivy League school, I believe.
Which of course made me so sad being a Jewish woman. I was like, why did it have to be a Jewish woman?
Black, I believe, Caribbean or something. Caribbean Black. Yeah.
Not representing us well. Yeah, I'm going to look up where she was from.
I'm not very sympathetic towards her. I liked her story enough to follow it for a couple weeks, and then I actually lost interest in hers. She only did it for professional reasons, whereas I felt like Rachel Dolezal did it for deeper reasons, her identity. That's where her heart and soul is, and it really is. I have looked at so many pictures of her, and she really did embody that Black experience to the best of her abilities. Whereas this other person that we're kind of talking about, she kind of just co-opted an identity to get an academic advancement.
Yeah, so it looks like her name was Jessica Krug from George Washington University.
Okay.
And we could put an article in the show notes. Looks like there's lots of them.
But in our Native communities, Jessica, we have lots of these folks who have transcended racial boundaries. We have Iron Eyes Cody. He's one of the most famous American ones, right? And then we have Buffalo Longlance, who was probably a mixed race Black American from North Carolina. And then we have Gray Owl. Have you heard of Gray Owl?
Trying to think.
Gray Owl was an Englishman. I believe he was of Scottish ancestry, born in England. He traveled to Canada in the earliest 20th century, and he became a native. And he actually jump-started the environmental movement in Canada. Gray Owl, very influential. He's a great man. He had lots of good things to say, but once again, he got pushed to the back of history because he wasn't up front. So, I got off on a little tangent there, Jessica, but, this is my career. This is the stuff that I love. I just love doing these deep dives into these quest of information and knowledge. And so for me, it was hard to stay on one topic because there were so many interesting ones. And so while I'm talking to these farm workers about sexual behaviors and identity, it dawned on me, one, that, what we were calling people who might be gay or bisexual, these men were neither. They were just men having sex with men for a number of reasons that, they gave me through interviews and whatnot, but they were having it for their own reasons, and none of them were part of an identity. And so it took me a minute, but it dawned on me that these guys were telling the truth. They weren't seeing themselves that way. Anyways, that research actually took me to southern Mexico for my master's research for that program, where I was in a southern Mexican community called San Luis Ocatlan, which was an hour south of Acapulco in Guerrero, Mexico. And this was the most interesting town that I've ever been in. It was 12,000 people on a mountain, one road in, one road out. There were about 7 ethnic groups. You had 5 indigenous, 1 mestizo, and then you had some Afro-Mexican people who were from the coast, but who moved in either through intermarriage or through economic opportunities. And so while I'm in this community for 6 months, I start talking to people about HIV/AIDS. And I realize that this information is coming in from the top down because Mexico has a national health system and every community has a health center. And so you have these people with biomedical training coming into these clinics, and they're disseminating the same information to everyone in the same manner, but each community is processing that information differently. And I felt like there were a couple instances where I was seeing HIV and AIDS becoming a folk illness, because it was leaving that sterile category of biomedical, and people were translating all of that information to fit into their worldviews. And so many of those indigenous communities were turning it into a folk illness. And I was really interested in that. It's one of those topics that I would love to return to, but I don't seem to have the time to return to this. So after I did that master's, I went on to Indiana University. While at Indiana University, I started to work in Honduras. We were looking at climate change and the effects of climate change on coffee producers throughout Honduras. And I started to spend a lot of time with coffee growers. I even met a group of indigenous peoples in the Santa Barbara area of Honduras. They're called the Linca. And this is a very long established indigenous community that had ties back to the Spanish crown when they arrived in the area. However, one of the things about the Linca, and that this is a question that everyone in the area said about them, they said that they were assimilated and they no longer were really Indian except through self-designation as being Indio or Indigena. And so I started to spend time with these folks, and I realized, there was much more to their identity as indigenous people than what their neighbors thought or said about them. However, I was about to go back and do one more summer of pre-dissertation research, but there was a presidential coup and I couldn't go. And so at that time, I was talking with my auntie up at Tuscarora, and I said, I got this project to do this summer. I can't get down there. I have the whole summer off. Can I come up to Tuscarora and kind of feel my way around? And everyone was like, yeah, come up. And so going up to Tuscarora, just spending the summer talking with folks, I quickly learned some of those same conversations that I was hearing in Honduras. Several folks were starting to say that about some of the Tuscarora for a variety of reasons. Some had non-native mates, meaning like Black, Hispanic, or white. And then other things, they're not on their Aboriginal lands. They are on lands given to them by the Seneca. 3 people at the time that I did my dissertation research, only 3 people left could speak the language, and they were elders. And 2 of those folks didn't like each other, so they didn't talk to each other. Over 200 years of colonialism, that indigenous spiritual base seemed to not exist on the territory. There was no longhouse. That connection to the Longhouse didn't seem to be very strong. It seemed to be somewhat tenuous. And so I just did my dissertation research on Tuscarora. Yes, I interviewed 88 people out of 900. It's a small territory, 9 square miles. It's about 4 miles east of Niagara Falls. On a good day, if you climb up to the highest point, you can see the mist of the falls. And a lot of people don't even realize that there's a indigenous community so close to Niagara Falls either. People are always kind of dumbfounded by that. Anyways, to get to the point of my dissertation research, Jessica, I interviewed all of these folks and I started looking at my data. And you know what? No matter what those criteria are that comes from social science or even from government officials, none of that kind of criteria can actually apply to identity. Because I talked to a number of folks and I spent so much time with them. And at the end of the day, when I finished my dissertation, one thing that dawned on me, it didn't matter if these people married in or they spent time in the world or if they were a Baptist or a Catholic or Longhouse or whatever affiliation they belonged to, they all pretty much shared the same worldview of themselves and they shared an identity. And it was something that no one could stop or snuff out. It was quite powerful, and I was impressed and amazed.
Well, I would definitely love to hear more about that. We are at our first break point, but when we come back, let's keep talking about it.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months or go to zencastr.com and use the code HEVO, HEVO.
This podcast is sponsored by Ramp. Are you a business leader considering a new credit card and spend management system? You could stick with the old school process, multiple systems that work against each other and create more work for you. Or you could try Ramp. Ramp helps businesses manage their finance operations with a corporate card and spend management software that includes accounting automation, vendor payments, travel booking, and more, all in one platform. Whether you're a startup, a small business, or have thousands of employees, Ramp's intuitive software gives you maximum control over spend. Ramp's smart tools enforce compliance, prevent fraud, and provide real-time insights. Stop overspending and save up to 5%. Plus, Ramp automates data entry and routine time-consuming tasks. It's all done for you. You'll close your books in hours instead of days and give your team time to focus on what really matters, the bottom line. And now get $250 when you join Ramp for free. Just go to ramp.com/easy. Ramp.com/easy. RAMP.com/easy.
Cards issued by Sutton Bank and Celtic Bank, members FDIC. Terms and conditions apply.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
All right, we are back from our break. I want to ask you, you're talking about, you've had all these different topics that you're really excited about exploring, from race to medical anthropology, and now you're doing this field work at Tuscarora. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that's more the direction that you ended up going after that with your career. So can you talk about that experience and maybe what caused that shift in your trajectory?
Yes, ma'am. I would take a tiny step back. So in my bio, you read that I'm Tuscarora descent. And I say that because of my mixed parentage. However, within Tuscarora and other Haudenosaunee Confederacy nations, if your mother is non-native, you do not have enrollment because you don't have a clan. And that's why I use a descent. Whereas, out west, nations out west have flexibility in membership. We don't have that luxury in the New York area based on how the Confederacy is aligned. I don't know if I need to say that, but I wanted to.
Yeah.
So this trajectory is a very interesting one because, while I'm working on that first master's, I'm also doing CRM to put food on my table. And I'm also working for professors I'm scanning in documents. I'm doing historical research. I am using a number of things, the Jesuit relations. I'm using the human resource area files. So I'm going into these deep dives of research, and I'm learning so much. And all of that stuff that I was reading before college, all of those ethnographies and histories, I kind of accepted what everyone was writing as the gospel because they were the experts. However, as I started working my way through my degrees, I quickly learned that, as objective as anthropology tries to be, it's quite subjective. And so I started to really get critical of the things that I was reading. As I'm moving forward through that first part of the podcast with my life, I'm also doing other stuff in the background that I'm not talking about so much. And so I became interested in CRM, like I said, doing research, but I'm also interested in things like national art and museums in representation of the other, i.e. Native folks. And so, I'm just adding on as many tools as I could to my tool belt before I graduated, because I knew at some point I'm going to be working in Indian country doing what I can. Because as I'm doing all of this work, I see a lot of inequities. I see a lot of inequities in how Native peoples are perceived, what our knowledge systems are like, our relationship with the earth, and how long we've been here. And it's been an uphill battle. I believe it was Vine Deloria who said, of all people, the Native has been cursed by having an anthropologist stuck to his side. I believe he said something to that effect. And so, as much as I love anthropology and everything that it allows me to see in people and our behaviors, it has also been part of that colonial project of defining people by categorizing them, by looking at certain behaviors in order to relegate them to certain statuses. And I want to change it because I see the benefit of it. I don't want to throw it out with the bathwater. You know what I mean? I want to keep it. The tool belt of anthropology is really useful. And so nowadays, even though I have a PhD in anthropology, I do not say that I am an anthropologist very often. What I do say is I'm a Native researcher who has a tool belt that includes anthropology as well as a number of things.
Yeah, so you collected all of these experiences and tools for your tool belt through, your undergrad and your master's and your PhD. And then you graduated with your PhD. And where did you go from there?
I went to the unemployment line.
Don't so many of us.
Yeah, it was not funny. Yeah, I actually was, I got depressed. I couldn't find a job. I started looking for a job about a year and a half before I knew I was going to graduate. I could not find a job. I couldn't understand why people weren't interested in me. I thought I was that good, happy medium between the two worlds. My academics were good. My transcripts, almost impeccable, 1B. I just couldn't figure out why I couldn't get hired. And so I started adjuncting. Mm-hmm. I started looking at American Battlefield Protection Program grants. I started looking at VAPs, visiting professorships, all of this stuff. And it was really disheartening. I've been encouraged to go get a PhD in anthropology, and I graduate with this honor. A lot of people in my family were quite honored that I got a PhD. I was one of the first doctors, and yet I couldn't even find a job. I did not know what to do. And it actually sent me into depression for a while. I slowly got out of it. I started adjuncting at a nearby school. I started to do Anthropology 101 and Archaeology 101. And then I did Archaeology 110 and an ethnography methodology class. I started to get students. People wanted to sit around and talk to me after class or go meet somewhere for coffee and talk about what we read in deeper depth. It was actually those students who got me out of that funk. And it got me off the couch, and it got me looking for work. And one day it just dawned on me, start my own business. And so I have a consulting business called Quillworks, Quill Work for You. It seems to be doing okay. Whenever I need some extra cash or another project, if I don't have enough on my plate, I can go get one through Quillworks. From there, the world kind of opened back up. People started to hear my name, and I started to be referenced, and people started to give me calls. And that has been increasing quite a bit since 2014. People don't realize that I need a day off sometimes. People are just calling me all the time. And it's just because of those early students, though, Jessica. If I didn't have them, I don't know where I would be today. Because I thought everything I did was, why did I invest my life like this? But it's turning out okay.
Yeah,
actually.
I mean, I definitely feel like personally, PhDs can be great things, especially if you really know what you want to do with it, but they can also be a little bit misrepresented and, have people, like you're saying, come out the other end and not really see much of a benefit from them. So definitely for people out there listening that are interested, do your research and know why you're getting a PhD if that's what you want to do. Because it does seem like sometimes people just go straight through and find out after the PhD that it maybe didn't make sense for them necessarily. Okay, so you started teaching, and it sounded like that really revitalized you. How did you end up working for the Seneca Nation specifically? Or if I'm missing a step in between, feel free to back me up.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of steps. So, Jessica, there's lots of steps between adjuncting and working for Seneca Nation. For me, leaving academia with a PhD, I did assume that I would be in academia. I would be teaching at some type of institution, and I would be using my summers to be doing field work. And so because it didn't start off that way, it was I didn't know what to do. It got to the point that my mentors were unable to help me. I just kind of kept going with it. It's not giving up. Because, for me, I always thought when I left academia with my PhD, I would be able to work for Indian country, but I wanted to work in New York State with the Haudenosaunee specifically, like the Confederacy. I mean, not just the Confederacy, but also the individual nations within that Confederacy. However, if I was out west and my nation was out west, the chances of me being hired by them would be much higher than being hired by the Tuscarora, because one of the things about the Tuscarora, even though they're federally recognized, they don't take any federal monies. And so they don't have things like infrastructure that other nations have. They don't have departments. They don't have government offices. This is a very traditional government that's run by clan mothers and chiefs. And so they don't have the infrastructure. And so getting hired out of school was another downer for me, right? Because the very people that I would like to go work for, they don't have the resources to hire anyone.
Was that a conscientious choice on their part?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I believe all the Confederacy nations do not accept any federal funds. And they do it because they want to maintain that idea that their decisions are based on their own needs and not on the needs on who's given them some funding. They say it a lot more eloquent than I ever could, trust me. But in a nutshell, that's kind of it. So, I did work for Tuscarora a little bit here and there part-time. And then I started working for a couple other Haudenosaunee nations on projects. And then I also had a contract with Seneca Nation through their THPO department to look at a Revolutionary War battle site. And from that project, that's where I made my connections at Seneca Nation. And so in early 2019, the museum opened up its director role, and I applied for that. And at the interview, I was asked, would I also be interested in doing THPO? And I was very ecstatic at the interview because very instantly, everything that I wanted to do with Native nations were suddenly offered to me in one job offer. And so I jumped on it.
Yeah, so can you tell us more about what all of those roles entail? So the director of the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, which for anyone who hasn't listened yet, you can also listen to episode 20, which also goes deep into the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, and then your role at the THPO.
So in 2018, the Seneca Nation built a new cultural center. And inside that cultural center, they house 3 departments. They have the museum, which is a department, archives, and THPO. When I came on board through the museum, my goal was to get the cultural center going because, one, there was a branding issue between the cultural center and the museum. Because as soon as the new cultural center was open, the nation was trying to shift over to the new name, and it wasn't registering very well. And it wasn't registering with local peoples. It wasn't registering with Yahoo, Google. What's that one where you, if you want to look at a restaurant, you can look at the reviews?
Oh, like Yelp?
Yelp. Yeah. So all these different websites, there was a branding problem. And so we were trying to sell it by the new name, and everyone kept going to the old museum to look for the museum, and the museum was no longer there, right? And so from that point on, it's all been about this rebranding process. But along the way, myself and the staff, we have been very earnest in developing kind of a Seneca brand in terms of how the nation would like to define itself and how it expresses itself through exhibits. And so throughout the museum, we try to make sure that we have seasonal exhibits showcasing various types of cultural practices and endeavors. We try to highlight historical moments. We try to bring those moments where the community really came together as a unit, as a nation. We try to keep culture going. We sponsor arts and craft classes. And then every Thursday in the fall and spring, we have a speaker series. And those speakers can range from local historians, native or non-native, all the way up to someone who has some kind of expertise on something that revolves around Seneca or Haudenosaunee culture. And so in a giving speaker series season, we can have everyone from a local projectile point collector all the way up to someone esteemed like Dr. Lawrence Houtman coming in to talk about his new book. So it really varies, and it's really interesting because it just keeps people coming in through the doors. With THPO, that was very interesting. Whereas with the museum, I could kind of pick up where the former director left off and kind of go forward and then kind of develop a new plan with the board. THPO was a little bit different. When I showed up at THPO, the office was basically shuttered for a month or so. And I was given an email, and everyone made sure that the world knew that Seneca Nation had a new THPO officer. And within that first day, started coming the property checks, relationship building. It's really fast moving. That 30-day window to do consultations, it might seem long sometimes, but it's really not. I would actually like to see that window kind of grow a little bit based on our day-to-day needs. So prior to coming to Seneca Nation, I was involved in some NAGPRA endeavors. I was working on some NAGPRA-related projects for a few universities and a few nations. And so I actually had a pretty good background in NAGPRA. But coming to Seneca Nation, there's a spirit in the air right now where the nation sees power in repatriating objects and other items that they feel belongs to them back to them. And so they've been really supportive in these endeavors. And so in the last year, using THPO and the museum, there's been several times in the last few years where the nation has they repatriated 2 big items. The first one was Corn Planter's Pipe Tomahawk, which was at the New York State Museum, and the other one was the Red Jacket Peace Medal, which was housed at the Buffalo History Museum in Buffalo, New York. Both of these objects have been out of Seneca hands for over 100 years. The nation felt like it was time to have these items back. And so we worked on it and we have both of those back. I'm working on other ideas right now. So for me, the idea of repatriation is more than just getting your stuff back. To me, it's reconciliatory. There's a process in there that I think that the United States and the different institutions and states that hold on to Native objects and items of cultural importance should maybe willingly take more of a role in. These are moments where we can kind of repair that past a little bit and find ways to move forward. And so working for Seneca Nation within the museum and within THPO, I keep coming up with ideas of how repatriation can be a community-wide effort. And I'm not talking just for Native nations, but for all parties. This is something that we need to address. We need to have a national discussion on this topic, actually. I hear murmurs of it, but it doesn't really seem to leave our spheres, our collective spheres of museums and social science. But this is something that needs to have a national presence. If we are going to move forward as an equal, diversified nation state, then we need to address that colonial past. It's very important to me because it's not just objects that are at stake here. There are thousands and thousands of our ancestors still being housed in these institutions, and they're all on a journey into the afterlife, and they need to be in the ground so they might be able to complete it.
All right. Well, we are at our second break point, but sounds like we have lots more to talk about there, so we'll come back to that when we come back.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
All right. We are back, and I want to dive back into that conversation that you were just having about repatriation and NAGPRA, and specifically how you were mentioning that this is a time for an important national discussion and that you'd like it to include, not just anthropologists and Indigenous people, but others as well. So could you explain more about that idea?
Yes, ma'am. At this point in my life, I would say that I have a lot of areas of expertise. One of the areas that I continue to be fascinated by is forest diplomacy. So in the eastern forest of the early days between Native communities and European visitors, there was this idea of forest diplomacy. And within that realm of forest diplomacy, there were protocols that were expected to be adhered and honored by both sides. And so this idea of forest diplomacy is a intercultural space where both sides came and brought the most important elements of their negotiations together to combine this new idea. And so within that space, Jessica, of this forest diplomacy, there's an idea that everyone must be aware of the treaty, and there must be a continued cleaning and polishing of that treaty to be reminded every day of what those treaties mean and what they're supposed to carry us forward into the future by. For me, Americans and all Native communities should know what their treaties say because there was an exchange going on here. So for the Haudenosaunee, the Tuscarora, the Seneca-Iroquois, Cayuga, Mohawk, these communities made agreements with the new United States. They made exchanges of their lands for certain goods, services, and monies with the United States. And so in order for that to be a long-held thing, it's just not a once-off thing. It has to be continuous through everyone's lifetimes. Because as long as we're here, we're supposed to be neighbors and partners. And so as a result, when I think about these things, I think about the ongoing issues behind museums and institutional doors. These are things that every American and every Native person should know about. These moments are really integral for us to move forward because there's a lot of things not being said that need to be said. There's a lot of things that went wrong in the past that need to be said, addressed, and talked about so we can move forward. And for a lot of folks, there's a lot of shame and a lot of embarrassment because a lot of people they don't know what is said in a treaty. They don't know what transpired at these moments. And so as a result, there's a reluctance to kind of talk about them sometimes. And sometimes there's even a reluctance to talk about them with someone who professes to know something about them because no one wants to show that shortcoming of that knowledge that they hold or they don't have. So for me, we have an issue at hand, and it's a colonial project, and we have to figure out ways to dismantle it. And I don't mean it in a way that's a conflict. I'm not saying that we need to get up in arms and battle our neighbors, but we have to find a common ground where we can talk to each other so we can both understand where we're coming from and where we need to go. For us, there was a moment in our past, in our recent past, at the end of the 19th century, our ancestors in anthropology assumed that we were going to disappear, and so they were on a salvage operation to collect everything that they could of us. Well, guess what? We didn't go away. And I thank every one of these institutions for taking care of our materials and our records and our stories and our wampum belts and all of these other things that we hold dear and important, but we're still here and we still know what our cultures are. We still know our worldviews. We still know what's important to us. But there are some things missing in our lives. And unfortunately, many times they're sitting behind the doors of institutions. And I'm sincere. I don't think we're going away anytime soon. So I think it's safe to say that many of these institutions can begin a dialogue with us to return those materials that they thought that would be needed to be around in case we weren't here in that future.
So, okay, I have a question. So I noticed that in your all of your stuff that you sent me ahead of this episode, that you spent some time in South Africa, and hearing you talk about what you'd like to see, I just had a thought that, in South Africa, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it sounds in some ways kind of similar to what you're envisioning. I'm just curious if that influenced your thoughts on this topic at all.
Yes. It did, actually. So I was in South Africa 2010 to 2012. I lived mostly on the east coast of South Africa in KwaZulu-Natal. And while there, before going there, I learned about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I thought it was very interesting, but I didn't give it a lot of time. And so while I was in South Africa, I started to read about it. And then I started to read some of the transcripts. And then every once in a while, there would be a documentary or a short on one of the news stations down there. And I started to pay attention. And I found it really amazing, Jessica, that you actually had a moment where you had two parties, one who were the quote unquote the offenders, and then you had the other groups who were the quote-unquote victims of those offenders coming together to talk about the atrocities that one felt and the other expressed throughout their lifetimes. And you saw the humanness in all of those folks, and you saw the compassion of the victims of the past who did not raise their hand in vengeance, but instead opened their arms in welcoming these people into their society. And while I was living in South Africa, there were still about 4 million white South Afrikaners or Africans who took part in that. Most of these people that I knew were alive during apartheid, and they're still living in this new system without any fear of revenge or any type of reprisal against their person or home or family or anything. I just kept thinking to myself, what a wonderful thing, because isn't this kind of what we need to do here? Isn't this something that kind of just begs for? And, recently, we had the boarding school experience here. It's coming back up. It's in many of our communities, and there's still unanswered questions about boarding schools. And many of these boarding schools ended well before I was born. And so we have open wounds that need to be addressed. Something like boarding schools is a good example. We need to address these things. There are unanswered questions for peoples, and we need answers. And we don't have trust. There's a trust issue as well. And something like a TRC would be a good beneficial thing, because I also believe that the United States says it has this one set of values that it pushes, but my history and the history that I have read and come to understand, it tells me it's another thing that they do. It's not what they say, it's what they do. The reason why I also think it's very important right now, Jessica, because people who are in our generation are folks who had nothing to do with that past, and as they learn about their own history outside of social studies, they're kind of tortured and tormented by what their country has done, because what they're now understanding, what their country has taken part in, their spirit is a little broken. It really is. Because they're embarrassed that they have to address some of the worst modern atrocities happen under their government. And I think it's important for all of us.
So again, going back to, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, you were highly recommended by someone who had listened to your talk about New York burial laws. Since we're talking about repatriation and NAGPRA, I was hoping that maybe you could briefly touch on the topic of that talk. And I know that people can go and find the whole talk. We can have it in our show notes. But since it's so relevant to what we're talking about right now, if you just could briefly touch on that topic, the New York burial laws.
So, Jessica, in my THPO row, I had to do property checks. And in New York State, the former governor, Cuomo, set up this system to allow clean energy companies to come in with the safeguards a little bit lessened in order to ensure that New York State has a stake in future clean energy development, okay? Within my role as THPO, I started to see a lot of these solar and wind farms popping up. And so one day I was in a consultation with New York State SHPO about a particular project taking place on Seneca homelands, and they wanted to install solar panels on top of this sacred area. And the SHPO liaison told me, but Joe, these pillars are going down into the earth about 14 feet and it doesn't bother anything. And my thought was, what about the burials beneath the ground? And because SHPO was only looking at the surface, they did not consider anything below surface. And within that one report that SHPO received from the CRN company, it turned up an absence of results. However, the point that got me is that this particular area has been continuously occupied by native peoples for about 14,000 years. But on top of it, amateur archaeology and even modern day archaeology have pointed out and have noted the large number of sites up and down this region. And even right on the territory that produced an absence of data in the Phase 1B survey. And so I started to make my points there. One, how can you say those pillars aren't affecting everything when we have burials in the site? And even New York State archaeologists all the way back into the 20s and 30s knew very well that there are burials in the area. And so simultaneously, I started thinking about, well, what burial laws do I have to protect me? Because in this realm of consultation, there doesn't seem to be very much in support of Native nations in these matters. And so I started looking through New York state law, and New York state law has 4 pieces of legislation concerning burials, specifically Native burials. However, if you're an archaeologist working for New York State, you had to figure out where those 4 laws are located because they're buried inside other pieces of legislation. And it took me a lawyer to find out where those were. As a THPO officer, I didn't know there were 4 pieces of burial type of legislation existing in New York State. And most of it was never, ever employed because no one knows where it is. And so I was asked by NIAC, which is New York Archaeology Council, to do a talk at one of their chapters. I said yes. And so as I started to do my research a little bit deeper, it dawned on me that there were other elements here not being considered. The ideas of traditional cultural properties or sacred spaces, the voice of Native people, because CRM, you look at their reports and they're all secondhand, thirdhand, and most of the time they're copy and paste from another report. One thing that really dawned on me, none of these folks are reaching out to living communities to ask them anything until it's time to consult. And when it's time for us to consult, we have so many things going on. We're just thinking about the moment, and we're not even doing our own deep thoughts into how our cultures were situated and aligned in the past because we're focused on the now. So that talk was really several ideas that I've been thinking about as I go into these consultations. And I see a very real need for New York to address all burial legislation in the state. Because when I was doing my research, I learned about the people who were institutionalized. There was a sanitarium from the late 19th century that had a cemetery. It became abandoned, and then New York State basically handed all those remains over to a medical school. And so it started to dawn on me, these folks don't have rights beyond death. And I started thinking about that very simple Euro-American phrase, rest in peace. We don't have that luxury here. I started looking at the institutionalized. I started looking at forgotten cemeteries. So New York State has many American Revolution and War of 1812 cemeteries that have been forgotten about. So we have those. We have other people of color. New York State historically has had issues with African American cemeteries. They don't receive the same types of respect that a Euro-American one would. And then on top of it, Native Americans, we're attached to the hip with archaeology and museums. And so why are we continuously segregated from the rest of humanity? And that goes back to that colonial project of anthropology. It got a lot of attention. This talk got a lot of attention. One, I made a lot of allies. But 2, I also made a few people who didn't like me anymore. And these were the older anthropologists who had made their careers on doing Haudenosaunee related archaeology. And it's really unfortunate because, I feel like we're allies in this together, but yet when it comes down to our human rights, this is where I can lose my allies. Because I'm demanding basic human rights for my ancestors so they can continue their journey.
Well, and one thing I want to mention too, so past podcast guest, Dr. Antoinette Jackson, she's part of a group that started the Black Cemetery Network. So for anyone that's interested in learning more about abandoned, quote unquote, which they prefer the term erased Black cemeteries, check them out. I am so glad that you mentioned TCPs in there as well, because that was the part, as a CRM ethnographer that was screaming in my head. I think it's so frustrating to see how much the identification of historic properties in 106 just focuses on archaeology, but historic properties, like you're saying, that includes TCPs. And in order to identify TCPs, you need to do consultation, you need to do ethnographic research, you need to talk to the community, or you need to have tribal monitors. So that's my soapbox for the moment. And to close out, I'd be curious to hear your soapboxes. So either as a THPO or as the director of the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, if you could only say 3 things real quick about, as a THPO or about the Seneca people that you would want people to know, what would those 3 things be?
The Seneca Nation is the 5th largest employer in Western New York.
Ooh, I love that one.
Yeah. The second one I would like people to know is that the Seneca and the United States worked out a land buyback program So because there was a case in the recent past and the courts didn't side in favor of the Seneca Nation, but there was a compromise, and this compromise allows Seneca Nation to buy any of their Aboriginal land back, and it automatically goes back into their land base and it leaves the tax system. The third one is the new museum is actually a 33,000 square foot facility that holds over 100,000 Seneca-related objects. Before I came on board, the nation had really put their minds together on this and what they wanted to do in terms of preserving and conserving culture. Walking into the building for the first time, I was truly amazed by the wisdom that went into the construction of this facility. We are able to take care of all of these objects. We have room to grow for probably the next 10 years. But we also have a space created where the nation can take care of the objects their own. We don't have to send them out anymore. We can do everything in-house. To me, that was a very important step for the nation because that is one important giant leap in decolonizing museums because it gave them the independence to take care of things on their own.
Absolutely. And again, for anyone interested in learning more about the creation of the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, check out episode 20 of the Heritage Voices podcast, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. Yeah, so thank you so much, Joe, for coming on the show, sharing so much. Like I mentioned to you when we were on one of our breaks, I have a whole long list of other topics that I would have liked to have gotten to, but there's just never enough time. So thank you again so much for coming on, and yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jessica. I hope we get to talk again.
Yes, so much more on my list. Thanks for listening to the Heritage Voices podcast. You can find show notes at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/heritagevoices. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Play Music Store. Also, please share with your friends or write us a review. Sharing and reviewing helps more people find the show and gets the perspectives of Heritage Voices' amazing guests out there into the world. Don't we just need more of that in anthropology and land management? If you have any more questions, comments, or show suggestions, please reach out to me at jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org. If you'd like to volunteer to be on the show as a guest or even a co-host, reach out to me as well, jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org. You can also follow more of what I'm doing on Facebook at Living Heritage Anthropology and the nonprofit Living Heritage Research Council, or on Twitter at Living Heritage A. As always, huge thank you to Lyle Belenkwa and Jason Nez for their collaboration on our incredible logo.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. And was edited by Max Lander.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.